There we go. I'm a little behind the curve this evening. Alright. Give me just 1 second, guys. I was dealing with something. Alright. Okay. Sorry. Music was being weird. Anyway. Good to see everybody this evening. Thank you so much for stopping by. I appreciate you all. It is Wednesday, and so it is our Storytime stream for this week. And I am attempting to fix my camera. There we go. Having some slight issues. But thank you everybody for stopping by this evening. And I hope we can have some cozy time. I know it's been a stressful few days for probably a lot of us. I'm not going to get into it, but trying to provide a cozy space for people to just chill and not think about stuff for a while. So, here we are. For anybody who might be new to the channel, my name is Meshla. I am primarily an audiobook streamer. I read and write Star Wars fanfiction that I read here on my channel, and I have been doing so for about 25 years. Yeah, I'm dating myself a little bit, but that's okay. I originally started out writing it cooperatively with 5 or 6 other people, and at this point it's just me, which is fine. So I am starting to focus in on my own stories. And so tonight we'll be reading chapters 5 to hopefully chapter 9 of the story that I'm calling Train Your Daughter. I'm not using the Mandalorian title because it's a mouthful and I can't say it all. I have to actually read it. So we'll be starting with chapter 5, which I'm actually rereading chapter 5 from the last Storytime stream because I accidentally muted myself. So we're going to start there and get rolling. So let me find my water and get sorted. Hey, the sniper. Welcome in, welcome in. Wait 1 second here. Okay. Thank you much. I appreciate you. Hey, Ajo. How you doing tonight? You're welcome. I'm just getting sorted here, so just give me a hot minute. A little bit behind the curve today, apparently, but that's okay. We all have our days. Alright, I'm going to pull this over here so I can see what I'm reading. So if you see me looking off to the left, that is where my OBS and my chat is. So, because it's kind of hard to, well, I can try split screening, but I actually prefer to have it on the other side. Alright, I'm gonna grab a little bit of water. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna restart with chapter 5 tonight. See how far we get. Some of these chapters are somewhat short. That's before I started actually putting a page limit on them. I try to get to a certain point with the page limit. So we'll see how it goes. Now if I can just not mute myself tonight, that'd be amazing. We will see how that goes. Okay. Alright. Oh my word. How do I keep getting... Okay, for any of you who wear glasses, I'm sure you can understand my frustration. I swear I just cleaned these like 5 minutes ago, and they already have smudges. Like, what in the world? Okay. Story of my life. Not kidding. Not kidding today with that. Okay. Fixing my camera a little bit. Sorry, it's been funky. Anyway. Sitting weird. Okay. Please let me know if you guys can't hear me for whatever reason. I am still figuring out mic placement and things like that, so that I hopefully don't smack it and mute myself. So here's hoping. Okay. Alright. I'm actually going to try split screening. Give me a sec. Alright. There we go. Or say if this works. We will find out. Moving the phone away from myself. Oh, sorry, that was loud. Alright. Okay. Chapter 5. Jerry's finished dressing the deer in the corner of the hangar he'd set up just for that purpose, with a tiled area that was easier to clean. With that done and the pieces cut, it didn't take him long to clean and sanitize the corner and put the pieces into freeze. Marin perched on one of the crates and watched intently. At first, she'd had a hard time and had to fight the urge to gag. She was much calmer now. After a moment, she followed Jerry's to the freezer, leaning against the door's outer frame. Jerry's, I meant to ask you. I noticed shower controls and other things set at the right height for someone my size. He paused at the comment, thinking about how he'd answer that before he finished putting the pieces into the freezer and closed the door. It wasn't always Mandawad, or a solitary bounty hunter, he started to say. I once had a family, and a great love. He closed his eyes as he remembered. They were taken from me. Turn that down just a little bit. Marin bit her lip as she felt the grief well up in him for a moment. She hesitated and then tugged on his hand, pulling him down to her level so she could wrap her arms around his neck. I'm sorry, I didn't know, she said softly after a moment. I suppose I must talk about it some time, he said as he held her. He stayed there for a moment before entering the living room and pouring a drink, and sitting down in the easy chair. My wife was a pilot herself, working as part of a small civilian transport group between the colony systems. He began to tell her as he motioned for her to sit down. Marin nodded quietly and sat on the floor, tucking her feet beneath her. So, what happened? She asked softly, wondering if that event had caused him to become a Mandalorian. Partially, he said as he sensed her thought and took a long sip of his drink. She was on leave riding one of the company shuttles to the medical center on Catan, carrying our unborn daughter. The shuttle left orbit and headed for the jump point to return to the Tanaga system when a bomb was set off in the cargo hold. That's awful! Marin's face displayed her horror, and she slipped her fingers into his once more. Who would do something like that? And why? I found out the who, Jerry's answered. The why still escapes me. There is a group that carries out almost constant attacks against our people. When they first formed ages ago, they were mainly spies and assassins. Nowadays, they do everything for anyone who pays for their services. I don't know who paid for the contract or why, he continued after a moment, but I started on a rampage trying to find everything I could. At the time, I didn't know about my ability with the Force. so I didn't know that it was driving me further down a path I didn't need to walk. It finally took a Jedi and a Mandalorian to find me while I was on my quest. They were able to confront me and show me what I had become, and they offered me a new path. He looked out the window. They knew I was ex-military and saw how it affected me, and they both decided to train me. The Jedi taught me some of the finer things of the Force, how to use it in the way I needed to. The Mandalorian took me under his wing and saw how similar I was to himself. He trained me in the ways of the Mandalorians, which combined with what I already knew from my time in the military. That made sense from what Warren knew of him, and she nodded. I admit, I was pretty scared when I first saw you. It's why I ran. He nodded after a moment. I've been unable to get over what it almost did to me, my quest for vengeance. It stays with me, especially if I'm out on a contract. It does worry me sometimes, but I'm surprised I've not felt it here lately. Do you know why? She asked directly, as kids often will. I was expecting and lost a daughter, he said, quietly as he finished his drink. That's why your room is more set up for someone your size. I suppose that's another reason why I offered you this choice. Mandoade consider adoption honorable and just as important as raising your own. Marin blushed. I'm honored that you gave me a second chance. Most wouldn't. I'd like to think that she would be like you, he said, his eyes looking distant for a moment. And with all the training we've gone through, I practically consider you a daughter already. She blushed even more. She had learned a lot. From what she knew of the Mandalorians, they were proud, but they tried to help those they could. Vorentia, she replied softly, thanking him in the Mandalorian tongue. She'd been studying in her spare time and was glad she'd gotten the pronunciation correct. He smiled. Your Mandoa and your Katani are improving. Come on, it's getting later in the day. She nodded and stood, looking up at him for a moment. Time for bed? She asked, hoping he'd say no. She enjoyed listening to him talk. His voice was rather soothing. Some more studying first, he said as he stood up. I need to check to see if anything came in through the comm system. I'll be right along. Okay, she nodded and moved down the hall to her room as she saw him head towards the computer terminal. She flopped down on her bed on her stomach, leaving the door open as she pulled out her holopad with her lessons. He powered up his terminal and entered his login to check for messages. One came up and he read it carefully, and then read it again. The message was different from what he'd been expecting. It was from the Mandalorian who'd taken him Jarius under his wing many years ago. It was short and to the point. I heard a rumor that you'd picked up an Idik on your last contract. Suppose you can spare the time? I'd want to meet her. He nodded and smiled as he typed in a response. You are always welcome here, my friend. Before you jump into the system, let me know so I can give you a course heading. With that sent, he turned off the terminal and walked towards Marin's room. She lay in her bunk, engrossed in her datapad, slowly sounding out some of the longer Mandoa phrases. She felt Jarius coming, but kept studying, waiting for him to come in. We'll probably have a visitor coming sometime soon, he said as he slowly opened the door. A visitor? She looked up, setting down her datapad. That was odd. They'd never had a visitor here in the month that she'd been here. Who's coming to see us? She asked, hopping off her bed and almost bouncing excitedly. Believe it or not, the Mando that found and trained me, he said as he sat down in the chair. He heard that I'd found you and would like to meet you. Me? She asked in surprise. But why? I don't know. Curiosity, maybe? He said with a smile. He knows what I told you and knows who I was back then. Probably wants to check on me just as much as to meet you. Marin chewed her lip thoughtfully. It was a nervous habit. That would be interesting. What's he like? Similar to me, in his own way. He was born a Mandoad, known it all his life. She thought about that for a moment. I think I'd like to meet him. She was a little nervous. Jarius was the only person she'd known for months, and it was strange to have someone else show up. He nodded and then turned his attention to her holopad. What lesson did you pull up? She smiled a little and tucked her dark hair behind her left ear. I was working on some more Mandoa vocabulary. All right, he said as they started to work on some more of her lessons before she had to go to bed. Jarius made sure that the pot of Behot was fresh when he heard the comm station chirp. Reading that he was close, he sent Ethan the course heading he needed to take the approach to the house from a direction that would keep him out of scanner range of the inner planets. "He'll be here in a little while, Merica," he called down the hall. "Coming!" Marin called, flushing in excitement as Jarius used the affectionate form of her name. She entered the kitchen, hopping on one foot and pulling on her boots. She was dressed in a clean but by now well-used coverall. He chuckled softly as he poured a cup of Behot for them both and pulled out a third cup for their guest. "Nervous?" he asked casually, knowing she was. Marin chewed her lip for a moment, a sure sign that she was indeed nervous. "A little," she admitted, sliding into her seat at the breakfast table. She accepted the warm mug carefully, nodding her thanks before she sipped it slowly. He smiled and sipped his own cup, checking his chrono. It wouldn't be long now, so he turned on a beacon set for the specific frequency. Aboard the Werda, Ethan saw the blinking icon of an incoming message in the corner of his head. "Ah, there you are," he said softly as the beacon pulsed to life. It was a prearranged frequency they'd agreed upon several years ago. Slowly, he guided the aging D5 Mantis to the coordinates, gently lowering her to the hangar's permacrete. The ship didn't leave much space to spare above, but she fit. Barely. With a muttered curse, he unclipped his crash webbing and carefully made his way to the hatch. It was more challenging than it used to be. "Shab, you're getting old, Etika." With a self-deprecating chuckle, he strode down the boarding ramp. "You couldn't have made the hangar a little taller?" Jarius heard as he walked out into the hangar and watched the Mando walking down the ramp from the old D5 Mantis. "You couldn't find a more compact ship to do the same job?" Jarius laughed. It was a private joke they almost shared. Ethan chuckled. "You should know better than that, Jarika. This ship is my life." He glanced around, taking in the hangar and everything else. "Life seems to be treating you rather well." He looked around a moment and then spotted Marin hanging back slightly. She was nervous, as the man hadn't removed his voicey. Ethan glanced at Jarius before he sank to one knee, putting him to Marin's level. "Come here, Delish. I don't bite," he said, laughter evident in his words. Jarius glanced over at her and nodded. "It's okay, Marin. This is the one I told you about that found and trained me." She looked up at Jarius for a moment, chewing on her lip before she nodded and walked across the room towards the older Mandalorian. She stopped an arm's length away, allowing him to get a good look at her. "Sequoia Gar," she said softly. Ethan chuckled. "No need to be so formal, Delish." He reached up and removed his helmet. "I'm Ethan, or Etika, if you prefer. Your name's Marin, is it?" She nodded. "Alec," she said. His face was older than Jarius's and bore lines of age, much like the sandstone cliffs of Tatooine, as she learned in her studies. His hair was shot through with streaks of gray, but still bore traces of the original dark brown. "It's good to meet you, Merica. Jarius has told me that you're a fast learner." That got her to smile, and she relaxed a little bit. She always liked to learn something new. "He has," she replied with a smile and a flush of excitement that made Ethan chuckle. He looked towards Jarius. "She reminds me of a certain young man I trained long ago," he told his friend with a grin. It got Jarius to smile and blush a little. "Whenever you're ready, I have some fresh Behot inside." Ethan just laughed. "Lead the way, then. I'll just be talking to Marika here." He paused momentarily regarding Marin and allowing her to get a solid sense of him in the Force before he stood. "Now then, Marika, why don't you tell me what Jarius has been teaching you?" Marin nodded and started telling him everything she had learned. He laughed and had to remind her to slow down and breathe. She was still chattering away as they got to the kitchen. Jarius smiled as he refilled his and Marin's cups and filled Ethan's. "I found her on Coronet, orphaned." He handed Ethan the mug. "And she's been a fast learner with everything I've been teaching her." Ethan nodded. "4A," and took the offered cup, settling back in his chair. He noticed that Marin blushed and ducked her head. He raised an eyebrow. "Ashamed of your past?" he asked gently, gazing at her over the edge of his mug. She shifted a little. "A bit," she admitted. "Don't be," he said firmly. "You started a new life when Jarius found you. Your past is just that, the past. Don't let it hold you back in the now. He shared a glance with Jarius. It's what we Mandawade call Sinvatin. Do you know what that is, Marika? Jarius sat back in his chair and listened. He already had this talk with Ethan. She shook her head, and he continued. It means a new beginning, a clean slate. When you become Mandawad, your past doesn't matter, only what you do from that point on. Do you understand? I think so, she said after a moment. It's not an easy concept for some to get a hold of, Jarius said softly. Yours is a different case, Jarius, Ethan told him. Completely different case. Jarius nodded softly at the comment. It was clear to Ethan that he was still having trouble coming to grips with that. Have you talked to the Jatize lately? He asked. Not for a while, Jarius replied. Master Card has been needing to deal with some other matters. He just recently became a grandfather, I hear. Ethan nodded, keeping his gaze on Marin. He seemed to sense that she didn't like people talking about her as if she wasn't there. However, he directed his question to Jarius nonetheless. Is she sensitive? He asked. Very, was Jarius's answer. I've considered talking to the Master Jedi about that as well. I can teach her some things, but others he would probably be better suited for at his Praxium. Oh, sorry. Earbuds are bugging me. There we go. Alright. Ethan frowned regarding Marin for a moment. If she is to go to the Jatize, I would much prefer Card over some of the others. He's more open-minded than most. He considered for a moment. What kind of skills? He studied Marin as he asked the next question. Even with Card, though, I'm worried. Turn it a little bit. He looked squarely at her and saw that she returned his gaze. You don't want to go, do you? He asked, laying a hand on her shoulder as he looked at her and then at Jarius. She shook her head, her lower lip quivering. I like it here. Jarius nodded softly. There is one other I had thought to talk to, as he is of both worlds, but I have never met him or know much about him besides what you've told me. Ethan nodded. I haven't heard much from him lately either, though I did hear rumors that he's been working with Card and that he recently married. Zan? Married? It was enough to bring a chuckle out of Jarius. Ethan did laugh then. Indeed, I would never have thought it possible. He can be rather stubborn. From what I hear, he married one of Card's former students. Callista, I believe her name was. He paused, trying to recall the report he'd read several months ago. During all of this, Marin just sat and listened, trying to soak up as much information as possible. He couldn't be that bad if the Zane were anything like Jarius or Ethan. Callista? Jarius asked. I remember meeting her once before. A Jedi herself, right? Alec, and Zan brought her to the Mando Way. Ethan nodded. But when could you have met her? She and Danica are rather inseparable from what I hear. He grinned. Jarius chuckled. I took the time to see Master Card when he opened his new training academy, and I saw her there. Ah. Ethan nodded in understanding and turned to smile at Marin. I think you'd like Zan and Callista, too, from what I understand. He then turned to Jarius. From what Card tells me, I think she was there for some more training. I'm not sure what else, though. He shrugged, not wanting to get involved in Jatize affairs. I'll try to get in touch with him, Jarius said. But from what I understand, he's doing more and more intelligence missions these days for the Jatize. I may do what I can and go from there. I suppose that's all you can do. If he is indeed working intelligence, I think it would be hard to track him down. Ethan thought privately of the reports that Zan was off tracking some Imperial spies or some such. He wasn't quite sure what to make of it. And I'm going to stop there and get some water because we are about to be in an ad. So I'm going to get some water. So. At least I thought we were going to be in an ad. Should start any second now. There's usually a little bit of delay. Well, I don't know where this ad's at. Chances are it'll pop up as soon as I start trying to read again. There it is. There it is. And I just realized that I don't have my closed captioning on, so I'm gonna fix that. Okay. Let's see. There we go. Yeah, I forgot to turn on my closed captioning. Oh, I need a list before I start streaming, I swear. So I'm just gonna take a little bit of time and get some water. And have a stretch. Trying not to bump my mic. Because last time I did that, I muted myself. Alright. I should be back in about 20 seconds, give or take. Alright. And we're back from our ad. Thanks for hanging out. I appreciate you. I unfortunately have no control over the fact that I have ads. They are kind of necessary. But I do appreciate each and every one of you who is here. Thank you. Well, then, Jerry said as he emptied his cup and got up for another. Ethan said softly. He never liked talking about such suppositions. Would it be an inconvenience if I were to stay on for a few days? He drained his mug as if it were Nutrigal. Jerry's paused for a second to contemplate it. Not at all. It's a good thing we took that stag yesterday. And that is the end of chapter 5. I'm gonna peek over to chapter 6. We're actually not doing bad. We might get to chapter 9. We might not. It really depends. But it's... No, we should actually get to chapter 9. I was just looking at the time. Alrighty. I do not know. Anyway. Earbuds are being a pain. Alrighty. Chapter 6. Jerry sat back down after Marion had gone to bed. He pulled out a bottle of something more potent than be hot and poured himself and Ethan both a glass. I've got something you could help me with tomorrow, as a matter of fact, he told Ethan as he handed him his glass and sat down again. Mven, Ethan said, raising an eyebrow as he accepted the tumbler before raising it in a salute. Koyachi, he said. She's very good at hiding her presence from a Force user, Jarius told him. And I've been showing her how to conceal herself from detection while moving in a forest setting, which can be harder than in an urban setting. I'd like you to test her skills on that, an outside opinion, shall we say. Ethan sat back, regarding Jarius for a long moment as he rubbed his chin. What guidelines? He asked after a moment. Oh, sorry. If she's caught, I mean, you know how I tend to operate, Jarika. I'm a hard teacher. Was all Jarius said as he contemplated. She is learning the Mendo way, but remember her age. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. You're right there, but sometimes the best way to learn is Munjabar, which is teach hard. I will not hurt her, but it needs to be as real as possible. He was silent for a moment, considering. I have an idea. Maybe if she is caught, she has to try and get away. It won't be so difficult that she can't, but it will force her to think that rather than just relying on the Force. And she'll learn to evade sensors and scanners that a potential target might employ, Jarius continued as he thought about it some more. I like the concept. Being able to hide from the senses and other means of detection as well. She needs to know it anyway, so sooner rather than later is good. Ethan frowned. From what you told me, she didn't have much experience with technology until you found her. He scratched his chin. I have stun cuffs or normal cuffs, but this is your exercise. What types of things are you thinking? She's only just beginning. We'll keep it to avoiding sight and sound for now. Work on the technology later on. And the normal cuffs should do fine. Ethan nodded, mentally reviewing things. I can work with that. He regarded Jarius for a few moments. The older man seemed almost excited about the prospect. 4 hours later, Marin found herself roughly awakened. It was still dark, and she blinked a few times as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. She rubbed the grit from her eyes and looked a question at Jarius. Meven? What's going on? She asked softly. Get dressed in the camo coveralls we made for you and meet up with me in the kitchen, he said as he slipped out of her room to prepare a few things. Alec, she said softly to his retreating back as she slid from beneath the warm blankets, her feet hitting the rug before she stepped over to the closet and pulled out the coverall. What's going on? Another training mission? She wondered as she stuck first one foot and then the other into the coverall, pulling it on and zipping it up before she pulled her boots on. On a hunch, she grabbed a camo bandana that matched the fabric of her coverall. With that done, she slipped quietly into the kitchen, seeing Jarius already busy at the stove. A warm meal for this morning. But pull some of the dried rations and jerky to put in your pack, he told her as he fixed a quick breakfast. Do your warm-ups, and then you'll take the northern path out for a good distance. I want Ethan to test your ability to infiltrate and avoid detection. It'll just be basic today. Work on avoiding him hearing or seeing you. Later on, once we've improved your technology use, we'll move it up to avoiding scanners and sensors. She blinked, and then frowned. All right. She ran her fingers through her dark hair as she turned towards the storage room, grabbing one of the small packs that hung by the door. With it in hand, she grabbed a package of jerky, a few rations, and a couple of water bottles. With the bag over her shoulder, she returned to the kitchen and setting it down before she slid into her customary seat. He set some breakfast on the table and calf for Ethan before sliding a plate his way and setting his down. For a moment, she looked up at him. Will you be helping Etika today? She asked as she began digging into the bowl of cooked oats. She spotted Ethan out of the corner of her eye as he came into the kitchen wearing black fatigues, his graying brown hair covered by a black bandana. He smiled at her. Jait Fatur, Marika. I hope you slept well? She smiled. I did. Vore. Ethan nodded. Don't stress about today. Just use what you know and what Jaraka has taught you. You should do fine. And I won't be helping him this time, Jarius added. He'd been wearing the camo fatigues that he usually used. I'll observe from a distance, seeing how you do. Her shoulders slumped a little. Okay. She was silent for a while as she finished eating and cleared her bowl. With that finished, she hugged Jarius for a moment before she slipped away to do her warm-ups. Ethan watched her leave the room and looked over at his friend again. I'm the closest thing she has to any kind of parental figure, Jarius told him as he finished his meal and poured himself another cup of calf. Ethan smiled. I can identify with that. From what you told me, I think she'll do fine. Just hope she can keep her head. He nodded his thanks and drained the mug of calf before he stood, gripping Jarius' forearm in a warrior's grip. Ret, Jaraka, I'll see you when this is over. All right, Jarius told him as he put the dishes away in the washer. He then grabbed his already loaded pack and put on his weapons belt, checking his vibroblade and blaster. With a nod and a wave of his arm, Ethan followed after Marin. She was already a ways down the trail, moving quickly as she tried to distance herself from the house as much as possible. You can do this, she told herself, reflecting on everything she knew and what Jarius had taught her. After several more minutes, she stopped and ducked carefully off the trail into the underbrush, where she pulled a bottle of water from her pack, taking a long drink before she carefully put it back. The bag had been designed to carry a lot of gear, but was such that nothing would bump into anything else and create noise. Ethan went a reasonable distance on the trail himself before moving off and picking a spot and climbing one of the trees to act as a sentry post. The objective Jerry's had thought of was for the house to serve as a location for Marin to infiltrate into, using the skills that Jerry's had started to show her on how to evade detection, should she ever have any work to do on a forested planet. Jarius himself had perched on one of the rocks overlooking the entire area. He pulled out a set of macro binoculars to help him keep track of them, and stretched out his senses to get a feel of Marin and Ethan's positions. For a long moment, Marin stayed crouched in the underbrush, reaching out with the smallest tendril of the forest that she could. She could faintly sense Jarius off to the southeast. She took a slow breath and rose, shouldering her pack again before moving carefully through the underbrush. Since their hunting trip, she'd been practicing moving more carefully. She began to move off perpendicular to the northern trail, taking the long way back to the house. Ethan stayed low on his perch, keeping a keen eye out as he started scanning along the trees. He knew she wouldn't come anywhere close to the path. Let's see how easy this will be, he thought, as he continued watching. Marin paused in the shadow of a tree, feeling as if someone were watching her. She then crouched, running her fingers along the damp earth. Some of it clung to her fingers, and she whipped her hands across her cheek, leaving a smear of dirt behind. She did the same with the other before she tied the bandana low on her forehead, knowing her pale skin would show up like a beacon. She stood again and continued moving east, turning slightly to the south as she got into the denser tree cover. Ethan turned towards the south just a bit, beginning to look down range. He thought he'd heard something along that line. Jarius felt it too as he looked the same direction. He pulled up the macro binoculars and took a closer look. Just barely he picked up movement going into the underbrush. If I barely saw it with the glasses, he thought. She's been improving. Maybe practicing on her own. Again, the feeling of being watched intensified. She momentarily felt Jarius' attention turn her way, but she tried to put it out of her mind. She stopped to get her bearings in the pre-dawn gloom. Then she started moving again, but tried to vary her path. She knew that moving in a straight line would give her away much faster. Ethan grabbed the limb he was on and quietly dropped down to hang off of it. He waited until his body had stopped moving before he dropped to the ground as quietly as he could. Cautiously, Marin moved through the trees, hugging the shadows as much as possible. For a long moment she paused, simply listening. She could have sworn she heard something. Ethan moved slowly and quietly, watching every step as he cautiously moved in the direction he believed he needed to go. Jarius watched him drop from the limb and kept the glasses up, seeing it play out as he kept his senses open, sure to keep any trace of what was going on away from Marin. Marin froze, listening before she moved again, more carefully. She concentrated a moment, but didn't sense much besides that same feeling of being watched. Slowly, she moved further to the south, back towards the house, trying to watch where she stepped. She considered taking to the trees for a moment, but she wasn't sure she could jump from branch to branch. Her control of the force was still tenuous at best. Ethan was keeping very alert now, taking his steps carefully and listening for any sound or other trace of movement. She was close, he knew that much. Just in case, he lowered himself further into a crouch. Sweat began to trickle down the back of Marin's neck as she kept moving, her hand slipping down to where her knife typically was. She frowned and momentarily stopped in the shadow of another tree to rest. She knew that trying to pull a drink or ration bar from her pack would make too much noise. She remembered how keen Jarius' ears were. It was a few moments before she moved again, and then she sensed it. That feeling of being watched was much stronger. Ethan had to be close, but she hadn't even seen him. She took a step and then froze as she felt the twigs strain under her boot. Fairfax, not again. Carefully, she lifted her boot and set it down again, searching carefully for a better place to step. A rustle. To his right! Ethan's head turned in that direction to pick up where exactly he'd heard it. Again! Right there! And he broke into a run for a few moments before lunging in the direction. Great! Marin chided herself as her senses flared. She felt, more than saw, the movement, and she ducked sideways, feeling the breeze as his fingers passed within centimeters of her coverall. She slipped carefully to the other side of the tree, knowing he'd hear if she moved. Carefully, she crouched and grasped a large pebble, tossing it into the brush as she reached up with a force, trying to distract him. He rolled as he hit the ground, settling into a crouch as he came to his feet again. His breath was still steady from all the years of practice and combat. He heard the sound off to his left, knowing it might be a distraction. As he looked in that direction, she couldn't have moved far, if anywhere, from the initial attack. There were a few trees, most large enough for her to hide behind, but he knew which was the closest to the direction he had come from, and started moving off to the left. She kept her back to the rough bark, not daring to stick her head around the trunk to look. She could feel her pulse pounding from the adrenaline and took a few slow, careful breaths. Again, that sense of almost someone. Carefully, she turned towards the tree, grasping one of the lower branches. She knew she was cornered. After a moment's thought, she climbed carefully onto the lower branches, holding her breath as she climbed to the next one. She knew he'd probably hear, but she was out of options at this point. She stopped about 6 meters off the ground and flattened herself against the trunk. Jerry saw it play out and then saw Marin start climbing the tree. It was a risky move. Ethan crept towards the tree he suspected was hiding his prey, cautiously looking up occasionally as he moved. Marin looked down from her perch and her breath caught as she saw a movement. You got lucky, she told herself. Now what to do? Watching Ethan, she carefully reached out in the forest, grasping the tree branch a few feet away, at about the same height, and yanked, causing the branch to come crashing to the leaf-strewn ground. He saw the branch fall and knew it was from a distance away, but he still had a feeling about something. It wasn't the force, since he couldn't feel it, but it was instinct from years of this kind of work. He had a hunch. It was time to play it. It was an excellent attempt, he said as he looked up the tree and spotted her. It didn't take long to climb to the branch that she crouched on. After a moment, he had her in one arm and jumped back to the ground. As soon as they landed, he had her on her belly and clicked a set of binders around her wrist and began using her bandana as a blindfold. Jarius saw this and nodded. It was the same thing he had done while training. Marin squirmed, but he was quick, and she felt his knee press into her back in warning. After a moment, she stilled, slowing her breathing as she listened, her head against the damp leaves. She still couldn't get a solid sense of him in the forest, but she could hear the faint rustling as he moved. Your binders have a time release on them, Ethan told her as he sat her up, cross-legged. You'll have 15 minutes to think about what mistakes might have been made and how to correct them. Then the binders will release. I have 2 more sets, so you'll have 2 more opportunities to reach the house. If I catch you a 3rd time, the exercise is over. Understand? Marin swallowed and nodded, her head reeling slightly from the quick movement of sitting up. I understand, Ethan, she answered firmly, looking towards his voice even though she couldn't see him. She didn't bother trying to open the binders with the force. That wasn't the point. Instead, she turned her attention to her breathing as Jarius had taught her and listened to her surroundings as she reviewed what had happened. She knew the forest like the back of her hand, yet he'd cornered her. For a moment, she chewed on her lower lip, thinking. In the meantime, Ethan moved off quietly, quite a distance, not even bothering to remember where he'd left her. He picked a rock that was jutting above the ground for his new perch and sat down with his eyes closed, waiting. The little beeper on his comlink was set as a timer and would announce when the 15 minutes were up, and Marin would be on the move again. Internally, he was impressed. Most beginners he would have caught sooner. Jarius' training was showing, and his friend was right. She was a fast learner. After a few minutes, Marin sighed. She'd done well, but she'd gotten sloppy near the end. She needed to stay alert and aware at all times. Cautiously, she reached out in the forest, feeling the trees around her and the little pinpricks that were the forest creatures. She couldn't see anything through the blindfold, but got a faint sense of Jarius off to her right by several hundred meters. Ethan was harder to pin down. Somehow he was hiding in the forest, and well, she shrugged. Not much she could do about that. She figured she was about halfway to the house by now, and the air felt warmer, which meant the sun would be coming up in the next hour or so. That would make this much harder. She could see the forest in her mind and the path through it to the house. There were other ways to reach it than the path. With a sigh, she flexed her wrists, slowly forming a plan. The soft beep of his comlink caused Ethan to open his eyes, and he decided to give Marin a few moments before he started scanning the forest for her again. A soft click was the only sound as the binders fell away. Marin rubbed her wrists, reaching up to remove the blindfold and stuff it in a pocket with the binders. Her backpack lay on the ground next to her, and she picked it up, slinging it over her shoulder as she looked around. Getting her bearings, she began moving off into the trees, towards the south, but not directly. She could still sense that almost there feeling she'd come to associate with Ethan. It wasn't moving, for now, but she knew that wouldn't be the case for long. After several minutes, Marin began to see the trees thinning out. She had to be getting close to the house by now. Even from here, she guessed it to be 10 minutes from her current location. She decided to stop and rest. Crouching in the shade and overhanging branches of a large tree, she pulled her water bottle and some jerky from her pack, taking a few bites to replenish her energy and a long draw from the water bottle. Ethan and Jarius had done the same. Ethan from within the shadows of some of the trees while he paid attention to the terrain, Jarius as he shifted from his perch to a new position to see how this next test would go. He could sense both of their positions. They were getting close to each other, and neither had picked up on the other yet. He could just imagine how quiet they were. Taking a hunch, Ethan pulled a trick Marin had tried before and quietly tossed a small rock off to his right ahead of where he suspected her path would be. Nama! Welcome for the lurk. Welcome in. Good to see you. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate you. Okay. Frosty tools. I'm gonna take a little break and get some water. Reading makes my throat dry. And I didn't do eye drops, so if you see me rubbing my eyes a bunch, please yell at me. Tell me to go do eye drops. There's even a command for that. So if you see me doing this a whole bunch, please yell at me. Because I forgot to do eye drops this evening. Ow. Alright. There we go. Marin heard it and paused, flattening herself against the tree as she scanned the forest. Sunlight was just beginning to peek through the dense leaf canopy overhead, leaving bright dappling in some areas that dazzled her eyes. She slowly scanned, but didn't see anything, yet. After a tense moment, she ducked slowly around the tree and moved off at an angle to her previous path. It took her a bit off from her objective, but the more distance between her and Ethan, the better. We have an ad coming up in about a little under 5 minutes, just so you know. Ethan stuck around the shadow of his tree, crouched down, waiting. Marin's progress was slow, but she supposed that was better. The faster she moved, she would be easier to spot. She felt that weird, almost there feeling again, off to her right, and crouched before dropping to her belly. She then belly crawled beneath the dense undergrowth just off the path. He swore he could almost hear it, the soft rustle of underbrush. He closed his eyes and started to focus on the sound, turning his head slowly as he tried to locate it. Marin froze. There was that weird feeling again, as if someone were focusing on her. She stopped and almost didn't breathe, waiting and listening as she reached out in the force. The almost there feeling was strong now. He had to be close, but she also knew she should be pretty close to the house by now, maybe 100 yards. She could see the hillside peeking through the screen of trees. She was close. He'd heard the last rustle off to his left. On a hunch to see if he could make her jump, he recalled an old wildlife call he'd been taught when he was hunting as a child. Taking a deep breath, he let out the wail that he had been taught. The animal sound caught Jarius off guard. He knew exactly what it was, and knew that the animal that made the sound was from nowhere in Gatani space, much less the planet. It was a good trick. Oh, Marin tried. That sound sent chills of fear down her spine, and she bit her lip, covering her ears as she scanned the forest. She almost swore out loud at how close he was. Taking a slow breath, she tried to stay as still as possible, knowing he might have seen her if she saw him. It didn't get the reaction he was hoping for. Just in case, he moved off to his right just a bit and tried again. Marin sucked on her lip, tasting blood. And then he did it again. Slowly, she rose to the balls of her feet, taking a cautious step back and away, 1 inch at a time. Whatever that sound was, it gave her chills. Oh, how she fought the urge to run. She wanted to. Ethan was thinking. He moved off again, just a bit, remembering a saying about 3 times, and sent the call again. She'd been expecting it, but Chaucer! She tripped, falling hard on her butt before she rolled to absorb the impact. Frellet. She knew he couldn't have missed that. Gotcha, Ethan thought, with a smile as he stood up and walked to where he'd heard the sound, knowing she was probably still in shock and surprised to notice him. Marin's eyes flashed as she saw him step from within the tree line towards the house. She stood, balancing on the balls of her feet for a moment as she weighed her options. Fight or run. In a split second, she made her choice. She sprinted across the clearing and plowed into him, hoping to knock him off balance. It was completely unexpected, but Ethan took the assault and reacted quickly. She plowed right into him, and he took the force of the blow, falling back, but ensured he got a grip on her coveralls to take her down with him. As soon as he landed, he used his leverage to flip her over. She landed hard, a muffled oof, escaping as she rolled, coming to her feet again. She wasn't going to go down easy this time. As a child, she remembered brawls in the orphanage and circled Ethan warily, keeping just out of his reach. Ethan was back on his feet quickly and watched how Marin was circling. Jarius came down from his own perch a moment later. I think we've tested her evasion skills enough for this morning, he said as he got between the two. A combat test can come later. Marin looked like she wanted to protest, looking past Jarius at Ethan, appraising him silently for a moment, though she didn't quite relax. And that's the end of chapter 6. Alright. Hey, actually, we might get through chapter 9 tonight. That'd be cool. Because they're kind of short. It's all good. If you guys don't mind, I'm actually going to go do some eye drops while this ad is running. So I'll be right back while the ad is running. Give me a sec. Yay! I have perfect timing. Yay, timing. Alright. I am back. I have put in eye drops. My eyeballs are happy. Yeah, I spend a lot of time looking at the computer, so taking care of those eyeballs is super important. Especially when I'm, reading after 7.5 hours at work. Yeah. Alright. Chapter 7. Jarius entered the armory and opened up a case that held several blaster rifles longer than Marin was used to seeing. He selected the top rifle on the rack and started to examine its workings and the scope on top of it. Marin perched on the bench, tucking her feet beneath her, her eyes wide. "Derica, those are as long as I am tall," she said after a moment. Ethan chuckled and looked at the weapon Jarius had selected. "You've still got that old thing?" "It still works," Jarius said as he handed it to Ethan for him to inspect. Ethan took it carefully, almost reverently, slowly running his fingers over the worn metal. This was the first long-range rifle he'd given to Jarius during his own training. Slowly, he checked the weapon for defects, sighting down the barrel as he ejected the power pack and dry-fired the weapon. "I'm impressed," he finally said, looking up from his inspection as he slammed the power pack back into place and flipped on the safety. "I did update the optics on the scope," Jerry said as he pulled another rifle off the rack, opening the legs of the bipod and set it down on the work table before starting to check it over. "So I noticed," Ethan replied with a satisfied sound as he sighted along the barrel again. "They're much sharper." Oops. He hefted the rifle momentarily and turned, squatting quickly in front of Marin, where he began explaining the weapon and pointing out the different parts. "This is a basic long-range blaster rifle," he began to tell her, bringing it to his shoulder and holding it a certain way with his cheek resting on the rear stock. "You hold it like this when you're standing. This is the one I gave Jarius when I was starting to show him something he didn't know about long-range shooting." "That's because I wasn't the sniper in my unit when I was in the Marines," Jerry said with a smile as he kept checking out the other rifle. "I was one of the entry shooters when we had hostage situations and a regular shooter during Spec Ops." Marin's eyes widened, looking from Ethan to Jarius and back again. "And I'll learn too?" Ethan chuckled. "Look, America, it's an important skill for any Mandoad, and it's easier taught when they're young, like you." He turned towards her again and turned her slightly on the bench so she was facing away from Jarius as he lifted the rifle to her eye level, letting her peer through the sight. "We'll start easy," Jarius said as he took the other rifle, nodding at Ethan to take the rifle he was holding. "Just 100-meter targets to begin with." Marin gaped at him. 100 meters? The blaster targets were only 50. She flushed, hoping she wasn't being disrespectful. Ethan grinned and glanced knowingly at Jarius as the two men led the way to the practice range. "That's why these rifles have scopes," Ethan told her. "You can see the target better from a distance." She nodded, but then frowned. "I'm short. How am I going to see?" "We'll show you," Jarius told her with a wink as they headed to the range away from the house. Ethan grinned and shook his head, slowing his steps a little so Marin could keep up. "Don't worry, America. I'm sure you'll pick it up quickly like you have everything else," he told her, his tone encouraging. After a few minutes, they reached the range. It was set up differently this time. She looked around and could barely see something peeking through the trees a reasonable distance away. She figured that was the target. Once they were at the firing line, he pulled a few sandbags out of his pack and laid them on the ground for Ethan to set his rifle on, while he pulled the bipod legs back out and set his rifle upright. Ethan was efficient as he set up his rifle, but went slower so Marin could watch what he was doing. When he finished, he checked the sight, laying prone on the ground before he rose and had Marin kneel in the same spot to check for herself, as she was short. "How's that look, America?" She took a moment to check the scope and then grinned at how the target seemed to leap towards her. "It looks good," she told him. And then she stood again. You'll be able to adjust the scope's zoom using this dial, he said as he showed her the ring near the eyepiece. Then he pointed to 2 other knobs. Your scope is zeroed for today, but these 2 knobs will adjust the point of impact. She frowned. How does it adjust the point of impact? It'll change the alignment of the crosshairs, Jarius told her. So when you fire, your shot won't hit the spot you have the crosshairs aimed at. She frowned again. You adjust for such things as wind direction? She asked after a moment, testing the wind by sticking her finger in her mouth and licking it. Not with a blaster, Ethan told her. If you were using a weapon that fired a projectile, you might do that. With a blaster, you're all set once you're zeroed. Oh. She flushed slightly and scuffed her toe against the moss. So it's just angle, then? If you're dealing with a projectile weapon, Ethan told her, energy weapons like a blaster will continue to go straight, so you don't have to worry about drop or windage. Your main focus is to be certain that the scope is zeroed. Once you have that, where you aim is where you hit. She nodded again. That made sense. Then she knelt and studied the rifle, familiarizing herself again with it briefly. Your target is 100 meters, Jarius told her, and you're zeroed for 100, so you can get used to firing long range. She nodded once more and then swallowed hard as she moved forward, putting the rifle to her shoulder so the butt rested against it. With a slow breath, she rested her cheek on the stock and peered through the scope, her left hand moving slowly towards the trigger guard. She rested her left index finger along the trigger guard for a moment before gently sliding it over the trigger, careful not to pull it just yet. After another check through the sight, she spread her knees, took a deep breath, and pulled the trigger. Jarius checked it with his own scope. There must have been some waver when she aimed because the shot ended below his mark. Breathe slowly as you aim. Hold it before you take your shot. It'll keep you from moving the rifle too much, and it gives you better aim. Then take your shot before you release your breath. Mirren chewed on her lower lip and then nodded, lifting the rifle to her shoulder again. She took a few deep breaths, flipped the safety off, and moved into position again, breathing slowly as she counted. When she reached 3, she took a breath, let it out, and pulled the trigger again. Ethan checked it with his macro binoculars while Jarius checked with his rifle. Both nodded as Jarius told her, "Good shot. You have 5 more available before you have to reload power packs. Go ahead." Her eyes wide, Mirren nodded, wiping her forehead with her right hand before taking a quick drink from her canteen and moving into position again. Maybe I can get those shots lined up. She knelt again, bringing the rifle to her shoulder. She leaned against the sandbags. Her shoulder ached a little from where the weapon had pressed into it earlier. She did the same thing again, sighting down the barrel. 3 breaths. Count to 3. Then she let it out and fired. Once, twice, 3 times. Very good. Keep going. After another drink from her water bottle and some more slow breathing, she fired the final 2 downrange before she flipped the safety on and rested the rifle on the sandbags. Not bad at all, Ethan said as he looked at the target with the macro binoculars again. Just as good as Jarius did when he started to learn, and he's had weapons training. Mirren blushed. I've never touched a blaster before until Jarius started teaching me, she replied, standing and dusting off her knees before she took a long pull from her canteen. And that is the end of chapter 7? Yeah. Chapter 7. Yeah. I can't even keep track of what chapter I'm reading. That's bad. Because unfortunately the chapter number is only at the top of the page. So. Okay. Also, if you want to play around with the commands, please feel free. That's what they're there for. Most of them are self-care, but there's some ones where if you don't know a word, you can ask me to translate it. You can ask me a question about the story or my writing process in general. Any and all of the above are more than welcome. So please feel free. Astro, I hope you're having a great evening. Thank you for coming in. I appreciate you. Alright. And I'm going to take a stretch before somebody yells at me. Because people do. Because I slouch all the time. I mean, you should change the tips on these earbuds. They keep falling out. But they're actually comfortable if I'm just reading, so it's nice. Alright. Chapter 8. After a few days and seeing Ethan off, Jarius opened the door to a side room he didn't go into very often. Only a lit candle in his hand illuminated the room as he moved around, lighting the others in the room. He wore a traditional Katani tunic that hung below his waist over the trousers and boots he normally wore, with a long sleeveless cloak over it all. With the candles along the walls lit, he set his above a special alcove that held an image of the lady and knelt for prayer before calling Marin in. She'd never been in here before. She was freshly showered and dressed in a loose tunic similar to the style that Jarius wore. He hadn't said much about what would happen today, but she'd sensed his solemn attitude throughout the morning. Her hair was braided down her back, still damp from her shower. She took a deep breath and released it as she pushed the door open, stepping into the candlelit dimness. It took her eyes a moment to adjust before she spotted him, his dark blue tunic almost blending in with the flickering shadows. Jarius rose from his prayer and took the candle he held once more, lighting two on opposite ends of the table. "There are two traditions we honor today," he said softly as he set his back above the alcove and gestured for her to go to the other end of the table. And then he picked up his candle. "The unlit candles on the wall behind you represent your family. They are yours to light." After saying this, he turned to light three that were behind him. Slowly, Marin made her way to the side of the table opposite Jarius. She could feel her heart flip-flop a moment when he mentioned her family. She found herself blinking back tears, feeling a sadness well up in her chest. She'd never known them. It took her a few moments, but after a few breaths she nodded and carefully took the other candle, turning to light the ones behind her one at a time. When she'd finished, she carefully replaced her candle in its holder and looked up at him, her eyes glistening in the candlelight. He still held his candle and gestured for her to lift hers once more, this time moving towards the only unlit candle left in the room, the center of the table. Marin nodded wordlessly, picking hers up again, and following him as she moved her left hand towards the center. Together, they lit the center candle. Once it was lit, Jerry set his back in its holder and stood there, looking at it. Softly, slowly, he uttered a few words in ancient Katani. She didn't understand what he'd said, but something in the words resonated within her. She set her candle back in its holder and stared into the flame momentarily, feeling lost in it. "It is an old proverb honoring both our families," he told her as he closed his eyes. "We are bonded, in the Katani tradition. Family. In the Mandalorian way, I say unto you, Ni Kartaili Gar... Oh, I'm going to try that again. That's awful. My pronunciation is terrible. Ni Kirtail Gai Saad Marin Dersla, which roughly translates as, I know your name as my child. Marin gasped. Her lower lip trembled as she began to realize its meaning. You mean that? She whispered, reaching across the table to slip her cool fingers into his. To the rest of this galaxy, and for all time, he told her as he held her hand, you are now my daughter. He smiled warmly at her, finally letting the urge come over him as he knelt to hold her. She sniffled, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand before she buried her face in his shoulder. She felt safe in his arms. After a moment, she looked up at him, her tear-streaked cheeks glistening in the candlelight. Does that mean I have to call you Boer now? She asked, trying to smile. He chuckled. You can, Or you can continue to call me Jarius if you prefer. I leave the choice to you. She grinned a little. I like Jarius. It's what I'm used to. But we'll see. She wiped at her nose before burying her face in his shoulder again, taking in the scent that clung to his tunic. Smoke, incense, a bit of leaf scent, and the forest. Okay. I'm gonna give myself a drink of water. Alright. It had been a few weeks since Ethan's visit, and Marin stared out through the armor-plast viewport at the planet below. Remember to be careful with your feelings and thoughts while we're here, Jarius told her as they entered Catan's atmosphere. The master here is a very skilled force user. Marin frowned, glancing up from her holopad. How do you mean? She rubbed nervously at the back of her neck. Just as you've been able to feel everything around you, more is possible, including being able to sense one's mood, even one's thoughts. He turned to smile at her. But you needn't worry, I do believe. Master Card is a man of honor. He will not even think about that, nor will he tolerate any of his students doing so. I'll still be careful, she told him, looking up at him for a moment. She knew he trusted this Master Card, so she would do her best. She took a moment to put her holopad away. How long will we be here? I haven't decided just yet. I want to see if he could determine the strength of your skills in the Force. I know you don't like the idea of training here, Marin, but he might be able to show you some useful things that I cannot. She frowned. He was right. She sighed. You're right. I don't like being away from you much, she admitted after a moment and looked out the armor-plast again. Who said I was going anywhere? He asked, settling in on the flight path toward the card's landing pad. I'll be right there with you. I may even learn something new myself. Marin flushed. Nesita. Old habits, I guess. She reached over to squeeze his hand before she rose from her seat. He settled the ship gently in on the pad and closed down the systems before he got up. He left his armor off and opted for a tunic and trousers, his blaster on his right hip and viper blade on his left. He made his way to the boarding ramp and lowered it, noting that their hostess was already walking towards the pad. Marin was waiting for him in a clean tunic and skirt. Her knife was sheathed on her left hip. As Jarius walked down the boarding ramp, Marin followed a few steps behind, scanning the area on reflex. My greetings to the noble lady of the house, he said in Katani to the lady who approached them. She had on a skirt that seemed to flow with every step along with her long hair, and she greeted them with a smile as Jarius bowed slightly. It is good to see you well, Jarius, Jade Card told him as she returned the bow and noticed the young lady behind him. And I see the lady has blessed you as well. She has, Jarius told her, switching back to basic. Marin, this is Master Card's wife, Lady Jade Card. Marin flushed and bowed slightly, trying to remember her manners. Greetings, Lady Card. I am Marin Durza, she said slowly and carefully, as her katani still needed some work. Jade's smile turned into a grin as she bowed. Stefan had told me that you had adopted her as your daughter. I'm so glad that you were able to overcome what happened. You were too good a person to go through that. My thanks, milady, he said, looking at Marin with a warm smile before looking back to Jade. Is the master home? He's at the Praxium, but it isn't far, Jade told them. I had Renius prepare horses. He'll lead you up to the monastery. Marin's eyes widened. Horses? She thought, frowning. They're still used a lot here, especially for a trip like this one, Jarius told her as he caught onto the look she had. They're very docile, Jade told her, and Renius is a good horseman. He'll ensure you're all right. He should be waiting just over there. She pointed to the area at the edge of the clearing where Stefan had erected stables next to the old cottage. Marin blushed and nodded. I see him, Lady Card. She followed Jarius over to the stables, looking around curiously as she didn't. Oops. Looking around curiously as she did so. I can't read. Wow. Doesn't look all that different from home, does it? Jarius asked as they walked. Naish, it doesn't, she replied softly. It has a peaceful feeling to it as well, she allowed after a moment as she continued to scan the area out of habit. It's always peaceful here. The Cards have worked hard to keep it that way, and their children have also taken it up. They got to the edge of the clearing and saw Rhenius standing with the 3 mounts already waiting, decked in black and blue robes of a Katani Jedi. You know the meaning of the colors for the Mandawade, Jarius told her as they approached. Master Card explained to me that in old times it meant the same thing for the Jedi from this world. Give me 1 second. I'm gonna have to actually look that up. 1 second, okay. So, actually, is it actually in there? Let's see. Oh, no, it's actually in there. I don't have to look it up. Marin smiled and nodded. Reliability and justice, she said softly as they stopped within a few paces of the young man. She slowly approached one of the horses, holding her hand out, palm up. The horse sniffed her from a distance and then, with a nod from Rhenius, walked over to her. Jarius saw this and nodded. And good morning, young Jedi. Thank you for the lead up the mountain. My pleasure, the youth said as he said to him with a smile towards Marin as she started to pet the horse. Marin blushed, remembering her manners. Nesita, she said softly, turning towards him. I'm Marin Durza, she said firmly, reaching out to clasp his elbow in the Mandalorian fashion. Rhenius Card, he answered as he returned the gesture. Marin nodded and smiled, still slightly shy, but trying to take her cues from Jarius. She knew that she had nothing to worry about here, but she was still cautious. Rhenius saw her look and understood the feeling. This was entirely new for her. It won't take long to get up to the Praxium, he told them as he started to lead them down the trail. This way. And yes, if I'm slouching, yell at me. I do that a lot. Alright. Okay. There it is, Rhenius told them as he pointed towards the monastery. Jarius looked and noted that it looked like it had been built into the side of the mountain itself. He nodded and wondered how much restoration Card had done to the place. It was hard to tell from the outside. Marin looked up at Rhenius' announcement and gasped. It was incredible. She could tell the building was old, but it looked like it was well cared for. She shifted a bit, trying to get comfortable in the saddle as she was unused to riding, but she didn't complain. She breathed a silent sigh of relief as they finally drew to a stop. Jarius dismounted and looked at the old wooden doors. He could hear multiple voices from inside in unison, which told him that Master Card was probably running them through some drills. Rhenius walked on ahead and started to open one of the doors. When he did, Jarius heard multiple low hums as they entered the monastery's main courtyard. Or, the main hall, sorry. Marin slid out of her saddle and was close on his heels. She'd never seen a lightsaber before. When she entered the courtyard, she gasped in surprise, seeing the 10 students practicing a slow kata as they chanted. For a moment, she frowned and looked to Rhenius or Jarius for an explanation. They're practicing a basic pattern, Jarius started to tell her. Master Card uses a unique style, and that's what they are beginning to learn. He pointed to where a tall Jedi with the same color of robes that Rhenius had stood at the opposite side of the circle from them, shouting a command to which the students moved from one stance to the next. Oops, there we are. Marin nodded and watched with interest as the students moved slowly into the next position. It was a bit confusing to her. She's not been introduced to any sword work yet, but she found that Master Card's voice had a soothing and flowing quality, even at his current speaking volume. Is the lightsaber interesting to you? Jarius asked her as they continued to watch the students. Elec, she answered softly, leaning towards him. She watched for a moment, I'd like to learn some sword work at some point, perhaps some lightsaber work too. She paused. Do you have a lightsaber? He shook his head. The lightsaber is a weapon built by the one who wields it. I haven't trained with it, so I haven't made one. She nodded quietly. It's not your style, then? Is that why you prefer the bladed weapons like your Shoto and the Beskad? Never said it wasn't my style, Jarius told her with a soft chuckle. Katani take the way of the sword to a very spiritual level. The lightsaber is the epitome of that. I don't use it because I don't feel worthy of such a weapon. Yet. She raised an eyebrow, keeping her voice low as she watched the drill with interest. Typical of her age, she merely asked, Why don't you? He raised a hand to forestall the question as the students stopped, and in unison lowered their lightsabers. Another Jedi, this one in more traditional colored robes, moved to stand where Stefan had been, as all the students except two shut down their lightsabers and sat down. The other two moved to the circle center and began sparring each other slowly. Stefan walked around the outside of the circle towards them, returning the bow that Jarius gave him before they walked close and greeted each other with the warrior's grip. Sorry. Marin flushed and bowed, following his example. She had to admit that she was slightly nervous. Sakoi, Master Card, she said as she straightened. And greetings to you, young Marin, Stefan said as he returned her bow and smiled. What do you think of the Proxium so far? I'm going to try and finish this before we get into the ad. She blinked and flushed, looking at Jarius momentarily and realizing she'd forgotten to give her name. After a moment, she answered his question. It intrigues me, she said after a moment's thought. There's a history here, but I'm also interested in some sword work. I've never seen a jetikad before, she replied, using the Mandoa word for the lightsaber. And I'm gonna stop there. Well, maybe. Yeah, I'm gonna stop there because it's like 15 seconds away. Time for an ad. Sorry, guys. Anyway, we have an ad starting, so take this minute and a half to stretch, get some water, get a snack, whatever you need to do. Take care of yourself. That's why we're here. Oh. Sorry, it takes a few seconds for it to show up. So sorry. I'm having a snack. And we're back. Thank you so much for hanging out through that ad. I appreciate you. Alrighty. Oh, there we go. I lost my spot for a second. Not surprised. You are both welcome here for as long as you wish to study, Stefan told them. Inside the circle, the two students had begun to spar. Their movements were much faster now than in the kata earlier. Marin smiled at that and turned her attention to the sparring match, even though she was curious about Master Card. She knew that he and Jarius were both Katani, and she got the feeling that Card was as much the warrior as Jarius, but in a different way. Stefan gestured for them to walk around the circle with him to see the spar from different angles. The two kept going until one was tapped several times by the other. They stepped outside and shut down their lightsabers before sitting down. The Jedi that had taken over for Master Card called two others out to begin. Marin frowned for a moment before she decided to ask, Master Card, I noticed that during the match the students tapped each other with their Jete Kade several times. Wouldn't that leave a burn? How does it not injure? They are using training lightsabers, Stefan told her. The weapons use low power, so they will only sting if contact is made. This group of students is younger than they seem and have not had all the training they need before they are put to the test of fashioning their own lightsaber. Normally, one should acquire a certain level of skill before they begin that trial. She raised an eyebrow. Normally? The Jedi chuckled. Well, oops. Yeah, I need to change the tips on those. Well, there are some exceptions to that rule. Your curiosity is good, Marin. One should always have questions. She smiled, blushing slightly and hoping she wasn't being impolite with all the questions. She watched the second match momentarily before returning her attention to the two adults. Master Card, what kind of things does the Praxium teach students my age? All students have their differences, Stefan told her. Those differences appear in abilities that they have within the Force. Some have skill with the saber, some for healing, others for diplomacy, etc. In your case, that entirely depends on you. Marin shrugged with a somewhat helpless look at Jarius. All I know is that I'm good at hiding, and I learn fast with just about anything. Stefan nodded and looked to Jarius. And you were not sure where her abilities lie? Aye, Jarius said. I would like her to learn all that she would like to learn, but she's still my daughter, and she has expressed the desire to stay with me and become Mandawad. I do understand that, Stefan said, as the sparring continued. Then we can try to cover as broad a range as possible. Marin looked between them momentarily, clasping her hands in front of her. I'd like that, she said after a moment. I like to learn, she thought, briefly. I do have some skill with the knife and other weapons, perhaps learning some hand-to-hand to add to that? She shrugged. Jarius here could teach you that, Stefan said, as he gestured to her father. But there are some other things we can teach you to augment yourself when in a fight. Jarius might have already shown you some of this because I've taught him the same techniques. Marin frowned, looking to Jarius for a moment. Weir did mention that, but we haven't covered it yet. I want to learn, though, she smiled, relaxing a bit. We can start first thing in the morning, Stefan told them. Take the time to settle in and become familiar with the layout of the Praxium. And that is the end of chapter 8. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and do chapter 9, because it's not very long. So we're going to go over a little bit over, but that's okay. Chapter 9. I'm glad to see that things settled to some extent for you, Stefan said to Jarius as he poured each of them a glass of whiskey. He handed one to Jarius, and they walked out onto the veranda wrapped around the back part of the Card's home. Marin seems to be a lovely young lady. Jarius smiled and chuckled. She is that, Stefan. I'm surprised she wanted to bunk in your ship instead of possibly sleeping with the students that are close to her age, the Jedi said as they sat down, overlooking the lake. Other than me, she hasn't known anything other than the orphanage and a couple of visits from Ethan, Jarius told him. I'm wondering if maybe time here will bring her out of her shell. It's definitely something we can work on, along with everything else, Stefan answered as he sipped his drink. I did notice one question she asked you while you were watching the sparring. She has many questions, Jarius said as he took a drink and looked out over the lake to where Tracina rested on the landing pad. And you seem to want to ask the same thing. Stefan Stefan nodded. You could have continued training, Jarius. The path of the Jetithe isn't mine. The Mandawade is where I belong. I'm not talking about becoming just Jedi, Stefan interrupted. Zan walks both paths and does it quite well. Zan didn't go on a rampage to hunt down and kill the ones responsible for his family's death, Jarius said, standing up from his seat. It doesn't make any kind of difference, Stefan told him, his voice calm. I went down that path for a time myself. You know this. Jarius shook his head. You know how I feel about the way. Stefan merely nodded, letting him continue. I'm not worthy of the Jethikad, Jarius told him. I'm barely worthy of steel. I wouldn't think so, Stefan told him as he stood up and placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. I've heard about most of the jobs you've taken. You've only gone against targets that have harmed others. You've never gone against innocents. I would say that you have been worthy of steel and the lightsaber, but it is your choice to make. There we go. With a sigh, Merrin flopped backwards onto her bunk and just lay there, staring at the ceiling bulkhead. Jarius had gone a while ago, saying he wanted to speak with Master Card. She frowned slightly. She liked him well enough, but she felt somehow that she was almost being disrespectful. She knew from Jarius's lessons that the Katani were a very polite people. With a muttered word under her breath that would have probably earned her the chore of scrubbing down the hall, she rolled onto her side. She just felt out of place. She liked much of what she saw being taught, but she was worried that some would think she was too young to undertake the classes she had expressed an interest in. She rolled onto her back again with another frustrated sigh and laced her fingers behind her head. The Jethikad. It intrigued her. Jarius had been teaching her more about technology, and the lightsaber could fit in the hand, yet cut through almost anything. That definitely piqued her interest. Oh, she knew they were dangerous. Mastercard's comment about training sabers had made that well known. But something about them drew her like a magnet. Why didn't Jarius have one? That thought tugged at her mind again. He'd said himself he was sensitive to the Force. It was almost as if he didn't want one. What she didn't know was why. She could feel her shoulders tightening as she pondered that, and she took a slow breath. Focus, Merrin, she told herself. Running her fingers through her hair, she sat up and rubbed her face. Maybe working through her warm-ups would help calm her mind. And that is the end of chapter 9. Like I said, it's kind of short. Yeah. So, please feel free to ask questions in chat if you are curious, especially if you're new. Yeah. It's been a busy day. Merrin's gone through a lot today. Yeah. This particular story was actually one of my older ones. Don't take the publishing date on Archive of Our Own at face value. It's not correct. I would, even the date on the Word documents isn't correct either. That story's been around for a while, and it's hard to tell, like, how old it actually is, but I'm thinking probably at least a decade or 15 years. Yeah, it's been a while. So yeah. And I recently had to sit down and actually do up a a chronological order on how to read the stories, because I realized as I was reading Age of Darkness that it actually mentioned some of the stuff from this story and the other ones in this arc in past tense. So then I was like, maybe I should back up and read these. So that's what I'm doing. So, hey, sunshine. You are coming in at the end of my evening, Miss Ma'am. But welcome in regardless. I am just kind of chilling out. I finished reading chapter 9. Yay, I got to the end of the chapter I wanted to. That's awesome. And I still have a little bit of time left. So, for... yes. Yes. Yes, Grandma and Grandpa time is important. And I appreciate you stopping by. I do. And I'm doing pretty good. I've had a pretty busy day at work. So I'm actually really glad that I was able to come and hang out with you guys and read some stuff. And yeah. Yeah. I actually really look forward to the reading streams in particular because they are super relaxing. So, I mean, it was kind of a stressful day, but not for any work-related reasons, which I won't really get into that. But we're here. It's story time, so I'm cool for that. I'm here for that. Yeah. So we're following Marin around as she learns different stuff. It's fun things. And for anybody that would like to read the stories on their own outside of stream, to catch up if you missed anything, you can check them out on AO3, which is Archive of Our Own. You can also rewatch the VOD. Yeah, I can't English today, it's really bad. So, if you'd like to catch up on your own time, please feel free to do so at my AO3 profile. And enjoy. I had to I actually went onto my profile and posted the story the story order there as well, just so if people found it another way they could actually read them in the correct order. I'm gonna see if anybody is floating around that I could read into. Let's see. Let's see. You know what? Give me just a second, guys, while I get this set up. I'm not surprised. Alright. I'm gonna minimize that. And do this. And alright, guys. I'm just getting the raid set up, so give me just a minute. We're gonna go say hi to Panda. She's super chill. And she is currently playing Dead by Daylight. So, fun times. Shenanigans abound. That first raid command is for anybody who is subscribed to the channel, because it has subscriber emotes. And if you are a follower of the channel, please feel free to use this one. And I'm going to... and I'm going to get this raid set up. So... my goodness. I am totally being a pro streamer today, sorry. It's been a day. Okay. Okay. Oh goodness. Oh, I'm not spelling it right, that's why. Like I said, pro streamer today. So give me just a minute while I get this going here, guys. Alright. We're good now. Thank you guys for everybody that wandered by. I appreciate you, and I hope you were able to hang out and get some cozy vibes in the middle of your week. And maybe a little bit of downtime. I know that there's been a lot of stuff going on for everybody, so hopefully you were able to take some time and just relax. And I hope that you can have a great rest of your week, and hopefully have some time to relax on the weekend. Thank you again for everybody who was here, and I will see you all in my next stream, which is going to be next Wednesday, which should be SWTOR next Wednesday. So hopefully I'll see you all here for that, and have an awesome night. Let me get this raid going.